At MIT, we tend to view the world a bit differently than most. Maybe it's our need to see past the obvious, or our dissatisfaction with the status quo. Maybe we're just obsessed with asking the next question and solving the next problem. Whatever the case, we believe that there's nothing in the world that can't be made better, stronger, cleaner, faster, smarter, more life-affirming, life-saving, life-improving. So we discover, teach, ponder, and manage. We build, design, and explore. We invent, innovate, create, and cure. We apply science, and we engineer the future. Because it is exploring and solving that moves us forward. It lifts us. It's what makes the world better. It's what makes us MIT.
We are delighted to welcome you today for the 6th MIT Symposium in our house here in Paris. I would like to warmly thanking all of you being here today, and especially, let's say, our speakers today, Aude, George, Michael, Stéphane, and Vince. Let's say, we will share today their knowledge on an important topic. AI for industry, hype or revolution? You know, I guess you will have the answer today. Your presence and participation are what make this event unique. Artificial intelligence is often seen in two ways. Some think it's just a trend, whilst others believe it will bring major changes to industries and business models. Today we aim to go beyond the buzz, and with Vince we like to go beyond the buzz and see how AI is already making a real difference in our industries and what for future opportunities it holds. At Bouygues, we believe AI is more just a tool. It's a driving force that is changing how we work, how we interact with our environment, and how we can build a more sustainable and responsible future. This symposium, thanks to MIT, is a great opportunity to share ideas, exchange experiences, and think about how we can best use AI to innovate. Thanks again for being part of this event. Now, it's my pleasure to pass the floor to my friend Olivier Cadet from the MIT, who will guide you through the next part of our program.
Thank you very much, Christophe. And thank you. And thank you all for joining us here in the room, live in person, but also online. This session is being recorded, and you'll have a chance also to review and revisit some of the talks being discussed here. So we're delighted to be here. We're very excited to present a comprehensive program on AI, and we love the connections we have with Bouygues and the engagement of Bouygues on this topic and on other topics as well. I can tell you, for me, one of my favorite time of the year is actually this symposium, but also the session we have in September when Bouygues comes back on campus right after the students at MIT come back, and they do their back to school. They spend 2 days with us and really connect with faculty, engage with researchers, and understand the latest and greatest in terms of research coming from MIT. So we're delighted to have this connection with Bouygues and the team on innovation here. This symposium is an example of the impact that the Industrial Liaison Program has for its members. And Bouygues is one of 200 members of the Industrial Liaison Program at MIT. We typically see 3 ways of engaging with the program. Companies use the program to learn, understand the latest trends. So this symposium is an example of that. We put together 17 conferences during the year on many different topics, and our industry members have access to these conferences. We also put together webinars. We do executive briefings on campus. So this is the learning side of the activity of the Industrial Liaison Program. There's a discover side, which really connects companies to faculty and researchers with the objective to sponsor research. Last year alone, our ILP companies sponsored $69 million worth of research on campus at MIT, which is a pretty impressive number. And the third dimension is the networking side. How can you as a company connect with the 800 startups we have in our Startup Exchange program that you have access to? And how can you connect with other members, with students, with researchers and faculties? So that's the program in a nutshell, the Industrial Liaison Program. What I wanted now to switch to is tell you a little bit more about some of the speakers we have put together for you. And back in September, when we were brainstorming with Marie-Luce, Vince, and Christophe on the topic for this symposium, we decided to pick maybe the #1 question we get from companies who come over and see us on campus. What about AI? What's going to be the impact for us? Is it hype? Or is it a true revolution as we start to see it in some sectors? And we'll attempt to answer this question. And as Christophe said, we will have an answer to this question by the end of this symposium. So with that being said, we're delighted to kick things off with Dr. AUDE OLIVIER. AUDE is the Director of Strategic Industry Engagement with the MIT Schwarzman College of Computing. She's also the MIT Director of the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab. And she's the co-lead of the MIT AI Hardware Program. But I know the title she prefers the most, and she probably has the most fun with, is her Senior Research Scientist title with the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. So with that being said, we're delighted to have Dr. AUDE OLIVIER with us. And AUDE, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back home. I'm French. I've been 20 years at MIT, but I still miss Paris, France, so I try to come often. And so, navigating AI impact and the promise beyond the hype. So I've been working at MIT for about 20 years on machine and human intelligence. As a computer scientist and a cognitive scientist, I really navigate between what does intelligence means for machine and how can it relate, resemble, imitate, or be rather different from animal and human intelligence. And a way to try to look at the state of artificial intelligence those days is to see how far are those models in regards to human intelligence. So here are the stages of what I call mechanical intelligence. There's about half a dozen of cognitive processes that when they are all together working well, you have an intelligence machine or intelligence person. Perception, pattern matching, I've been here for decades, and now we are in the era of pattern generation or generative AI, and this will be the topic of my presentation today. Now, I want to be clear, anything out there in any model that say, hey, we are doing reasoning, that is hype. At the moment, reasoning, knowing the causation between factors and object, or being able to do metaphor, analogy, storytelling, understanding, common sense, that is only human at that moment. All the technology out there are able to do really fit of understanding and fit of producing tasks that almost feel superhuman to us, but they are still pattern generation. Some are sophisticated pattern generation, but there is no causality, analogy, common sense there. Sometimes I use the phrase AI as an artificial idiot, and that's where we are now. However, there's still a lot we can do with it for the next few decades. So generative model, I'm going to spend more time on this today. As an overview, there are really many architecture out there that produce new sample of text, image, sound, and so on. And at the basic of their architecture is usually based on one of those networks. Generative model that really started in 2015 with the GAN, or Generative Adversarial Network, then moved to a collection of models called autoencoder, which is the base of the large language model like ChatGPT and others, and the diffusion model. They all have in common that they capture the joint probability of the data distribution to generate new sample, and we're going to see plenty of examples today. So variational encoder are a class of model where you give it a collection of data, so here illustrated with a series of regions from an image. And the network reduces those data to what we call a latent space. It's kind of a meatloaf of a lot of information that the network has learned, and then can decode back the information to either give you the same kind of information or augmented or enhanced information. Imagine that here, instead of putting half of an image, I will put a protein or molecules. It can come up with additional component to add to that protein, but it can also learn to produce variation that are more or less related to the original data that you put in. And I want to highlight the work of my new colleague at MIT, Keming He, who has been working in industry for over a decade, is one of the father, the innovator behind many of those autoencoders. And in the field of academia, we often look at how many citations we have, which tells about the work we have done in the field and its impact. And Keming has over 500 million citations for his work. So diffusion model is another class of model that is used really quite a lot those days in order to create new sample. Again, it's the base of generative AI, and it's actually used a lot in video because it's a way to generate collection of images one after the other following some rules, and those rules you can constrain them with language, or what we call metadata. And the diffusion model principle is you have, let's say, an image or a string of data, and you're adding progressively noise to end up with an image that has actually a lot of additional noise to it. And the network learn what are the noise to remove back with the reverse diffusion path in order to recreate back your original data, or in order to apply some changes to it. And this approach is very, very powerful because in this process you can put different type of data in as input. You can constrain it with language or other type of data. So we all heard about the transformers, the large language model, which are the base of GPT. And this is based on the encoder-decoder architecture that I showed a few slides ago with a text processing mechanism. And here what it does, you have this very, very large model, artificial neural network, And if you put some text in, the networks learn to give you the next word, what we call a token, the next word and the next word and so on. Following, and larger the database is, more correct actually the filling up the next words will be. So in a recursive manner like that. And I asked my colleague Yoon Kim, who is an expert with those large language models, what will be the one slide, the one schema you could show people so they remember really what those models do? And he sent me this, the autocomplete system that predicts the next word. This is only what those systems do. No reasoning, no magic, a lot of data, large context. If you give you a lot, if you give it a lot of text, it can remember if you come back to give more text. But this is still what we call an autocomplete system that add the next word. So generative AI has taken a few fields of science and technology by a storm, because those models, when you give it a lot of data, can start really generating samples, new samples that look different from the original or can resemble the original, which can suddenly create, give you a lot of ideas of possibility in design or images, video, for text, word, translation, and sound. And we have over 250 faculty at MIT that work on one or more domain of generative, or AI in general, machine learning, generative model, and related. And I wanted to highlight the work of one of my colleagues, Wojciech Matusik, who is working on a very interesting and powerful schema, which is that, there's a lot out there of design and structure that can be represented by what we call graph. And my colleague Markus BUEHLER will talk also about this in his talk. And if you have a graph, which is illustrated on the slide, then you can encode it as text. And if you have text or string, then you can use those architecture based on large language model in order to generate new sample. So when we think about large language model, we actually remove the word language, is more large string of data model, because as long as you can transform your initial data into a graph and then a text, a collection of string, then you might have a powerful system that can learn to generate new sample. So another domain where we do expect a lot of breakthrough coming in is drug development, healthcare, and in general the creation and discovery of new molecule that can be applied to develop new material, help with sustainability, biodiversity, and so on. And this is really an amazing space to explore for chemists and biologists working with experts in computer science, and I'm highlighting the work of 3 colleagues here, because the chemical space is truly infinite. Therefore, you can see how those models would be able to generate and give a lot of good ideas. So there's a lot of challenge there. Just to give a few, I'm going to speak about the notion of hallucination and why this is happening in those models, because if you use any of those generative approach, you have no idea at the beginning if the data generated are actually true or just something that doesn't match your original hypothesis. You have to check this. So there's quite a lot of work to do on the output. But researchers are working on the metric to estimate success. And we all need to be aware that this may change the landscape of the chemical and biological threat. But there's a lot of work, and I think that will be part of the revolution. So I told you generative AI generates sample, and the basic idea is that you give it some initial data, and it can translate, transform, adapt the data into something else. So where the field is now also exploding is multimodal data, and the notion that if you can translate from one language to another language, or from a design to graph to text, well, you can also translate some data into another format. In that case, data that can be generated from consumer devices, like that will be from the watch you may be wearing, and those models are now able to generate other biosensor data like EEG or brain signal data. And this is the work of my colleague Dina Katabi. So again, when you think of generative AI, you think outside the box of the modality, because we can start with enough data, and those models look at the correlation existing between data you had no idea you could relate together. So generative AI generates also sample that we are almost at the crisp of science fiction here. And this is also where I really love to be at MIT, because I always tell my colleague, the future is already here. There's a collection of work you can look at and see what comes next. So this is actually my research. And what we do into the lab using those generative models is we train, we build an AI generative approach with data, combining data from the brain, fMRI, with language and video. It's very multimodal. And when we give new data that the model has not seen, that directly come from the brain, the model is able to show the potential video, in that case, that the person were looking at in the scanner. So it's really just the beginning of this sort of research, but it shows you the power of a lot of data and those generative algorithms in order to translate from one set of data into another. And when I show you here are videos that were shown to people into the scanner, and the resulting reconstructed in a circle video that the model was telling us, yes, that person saw this sort of video. So one thing that is common to all those generative approach is the notion of hallucination that you have heard certainly when we talk about those models. And this is something that is very true and really very deep in all those machine learning models. Everything that a generative model produces comes from the same process of statistically reconstructing the components that make sense, are more likely in a context. Therefore, 100% of what it generates is hallucination. Everything is reconstructed. So when you ask for a text and it spills out a text that is identical to something that was gathered on the web, it is because that piece of text has been repeated a lot into the training data set, and the model just really has learned that the probability in that context is this next work and this next word, and then can do this sort of plagiarism. But it was reconstructed. So with 100% of things reconstructed, it's like us. Sometimes things will match the reality of the world and the truth, and sometimes it will not. And at the moment, it's pretty much impossible to know in which cases the model will produce what we call hallucination, or really error that we do not want into our business. So because it will generate sample, the sample can be more or less novel, more or less similar to what it has learned. But again, remember, it is an autocomplete system. Just add the next word, and it hallucinates 100% of the time. That's part of the bad and the ugly. So what is generative AI good for? So I'm using the word translation here, really as something very general. And translation, when you think of it, only needs historical or past data. So you can translate within or across language, including human and animal language. Let's think about this. Across modalities, content, sensor, I gave you some example, text to sound, and so on. Updating content, which is translating into a different version, you can rewrite the text, rewrite the voice, change the voice, rewrite, change a part of video. Those are all under the idea of this translation based on historical data, and this can work very well. Particularly summarizing, which is translating from a lot for the model, from a lot of data to a few. So all application that will be into that domain of translation, knowing that it only generates the next token, and where there is no prediction or no loop, where you're asking something and the model will respond, and so on. Well, those, I will qualify them as good application. You always need a human in the loop, but there's a lot of potential businesses out there. And if you have a task that you can converge into the question, what is the next token for this, then the current state-of-the-art generative model can be a good model to use for your application. Now, as a cognitive scientist, I'm very sensitive to the impact of those models into our daily life. And I wanted to alarm you about what those models might be able to do at some point. And it's very true that some of us fear that they can distort what we call human belief. So when you meet people, when you gather information from the world, or when your kids is at school learning, we are all changing our belief and building what we think about the world. And in this illustration, one of the problem with those AI generative model is that they can really give you a lot of information, and a lot of information you don't know, so you will be more sensitive to learn about it. And you might have this belief that you understand more than what actually you do, because the model will have this certainty and will looks like you're talking to a person, but there is no reasoning, no causality, no common sense. But you can be basically, if you forget that those are really just statistical generator of the next token, which a lot of people out there don't know necessarily, you can fall in that trap. There's also things we see that we can falsely believe that we see all the hypotheses out there that the generative model will give us. However, it's only giving a portion of it. And the other thing is, we could also think the model has no standpoint, or the model has all standpoint, whereas currently those models have the standpoint of the training data and the developer. So one of the things that I think is absolutely mandatory if you want to have a model let loose in the world or used for large-scale application is to be able to interpret the output, to know why the system gave you a particular answer. And there's a lot of work at MIT on this topic, and my colleague Antonio Torralba is one of the world leader on this, where he developed method that when you have a model, generative model, giving you an input, then his approach can inform you of why the model decided to do this. And I was recently talking with people who were very worried about the fact that the model out there are a black box, and somebody said something that resonates a lot with me. She said, settling for the black box is a lack of ambition. And I think that's very right. There's a lot of hype out there of using those models for various tasks, but you really need to know what's going on inside. So all this being said, there's a lot of good things happening at MIT in this field of generative intelligence. And about 5 years ago, MIT built a new college within its collection of schools. So it's like a school, but it's called a college, and it hosts several academic departments and labs that are all focusing on computing. So computing means machine learning, data science, quantum computing when it comes up. And Daniel Huttenlocher, who is the dean of the college, has done a fantastic job to convene a lot of the faculty and the students all around campus to create new research projects between disciplines, new courses, while also incorporating social and ethical consideration in their work. And one of the landmark of the college has been the creation of, so far, nearly 50 new faculty positions that we call computing bilingual. Those are faculty that work across domain between one field of computer science and another domain, for instance, neuroscience, chemistry, biology, engineering, and so on. And I want to highlight the work of a few of those faculty. So leading the MIT IBM lab, I'm faced with a lot of questions coming from IBM as well as the corporate members working with us about which type of research can lead to a real breakthrough in industry. And so for those research projects, we team together MIT faculty as well as IBM researchers. And here we have a project from Cherry Wang on improving local weather forecasting. She's an expert in climate change and machine learning. We also have work that look at how to make those generative model and AI machine model in general smaller and more efficient. So when you ask them a question, they respond right away. So there's really no time between the question asked by the user and the responses. We work a lot with new algorithm for large language model. And I wanted to end this presentation with the work of Sarah Berry, one of my colleagues next door at MIT. She's a new faculty working in machine learning and sustainability and biodiversity. So she literally look at, well, if you want to build up a new neighborhood or if you want to update the green area into a region, or actually she has a new project where she wants to tag shark in the ocean, because yes, while sharks are being impacted by the climate and then they are changing their behavior. So if it touches on biodiversity, natural ecology, and machine learning, she will be the one. Thank you very much. Let's take some questions.
Thank you very much, Aude. That was extremely interesting, and it shows really the variety of topics being addressed at MIT around AI. You have a chance to ask questions directly in the room, but also using what we call Pigeonhole. So if you click on that QR code or with your iPhone or your cell phone, you'll be able to be directed to a site that allows you to ask direct questions. And there's already a couple that we can address. Do you want to take maybe the first one?
Yeah, so aside from the three models I've shown, any other new architecture that's improvising. So my colleague Markus will also talk about graph neural networks, which is another type of architecture that can solve some problem that those might not do very well. And so what we do see at the moment, is there is a model. A model is usually one neural network, a couple of neural networks. However, more and more the papers or what you see into the company are system, where they put together different type of architectures, and that become really like a very large system, a monster system that then is a collection of different algorithms. So are there some new architecture that are coming up? I will refer to the innovation space at MIT, where we have a lot of startup coming up and rising every month. And a lot of the new development in the startup we see is actually on new architecture. And there is one of them that we know very well at CCEL, because my colleague Daniela Russ is one of the co-founders. It's called liquid neural networks. And this is a new type of architecture. So those needs to be tested with the benchmark and so on. However, I see a lot of innovation, so it's not impossible that next year for your symposium there will be new architecture that will excite many of us.
Maybe along these lines, Aude, it's not a question that was asked, but I read recently in a report from Stanford that a lot of the models today that are being developed are actually being developed in industry, not in academia.
Yeah.
Can you comment a little bit on this?
Yeah, so I had a slide that I removed, so I'm going to try to explain to you so you can visualize. So in order to train those models, you need computing power, let's say GPUs. On those models, if you want to characterize them with numbers, you can characterize them with the numbers of parameters they have. So parameters, let me give you an example. A human brain has about 100 trillion parameters. So those parameters, those models out there, there are 3 billion, 70 billion, 500 billion parameters. I think one of the Gemini model is really above the 500 billion parameters. And those models is when you want to use them for large scale. But you can ask yourself, where do they come from? At the origin, every single of those large architecture were a baby architecture that came up from, most of the time, academia, that was run and developed on just a few GPU on a small model scale, starting with liquid neural networks. They all start as baby network. They all start in academia or in the industry. What you see are the grown-up version with the billion of the parameters. The algorithmic development always come from research. And there are 100 coming up.
Great. So that emphasizes also the importance of industry, but also the importance of the connection between academia and industry in that. There's a very interesting question that gets quite a few votes. How far are we, with your brain example, to be able to pick up what people actually think?
This is a very hot and difficult questions. What you have seen here, what I've shown you, are a model that was given really hundreds of hours, thousands of hours to learn from, and in order to test on a person, the person had to be in the scanner for hours, collecting data from the fMRI scanners, and those actually are pretty high resolution. So long story short, there is no way anytime soon there will be anything on the consumer side that can pick up whatever is happening in your brain. I know there's some device that can pick up if somebody is thinking left or right, and there is some startup on this. But when we comes to really what we think, there is nothing near this. There's also what I shown you was vision for vision, transforming this to our thoughts. Let's say I am not worried, and I'm developing them, but that's research, not anytime soon.
Great, thank you. It seems that your artificial idiot, as AI, picked up a lot of momentum. So can you elaborate a little bit on this and help us understand how and when AI actually hallucinates?
All those models out there are what we call pattern generation, pattern matching. That's the example I show you. Even the brain one, from the fMRI data to possible video, this is pattern matching. It's a matching between data and a change to another set of data. And when I say the word artificial idiot, is that anything that is intelligence close to our level or way to adapt needs analogy, reasoning, causal reasoning, understanding of the physics of the world, common sense. At the moment, there is no algorithm out there that can approach those abilities. When you see those, you play with those models, and they can spill out, they can resolve math concept or spill out some chain of thoughts for a process. They are based on task familiarity. It means that the large model learn a lot of example. You gave it a lot of example, and just give back one of those examples with potentially some changes to it. So it's a huge sort of memory. There's no reasoning in it. And every time there's some of those models, I go and I play for a minute or two. I test them with some question coming from human cognitive science, and then I basically close the application because I know it's not there yet.
Great, thank you. So we have 2 minutes left. I'll take the third question, actually. So this week, you probably all saw on Monday, Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to two MIT professors. And you know, they raise an interesting question about the hype around AI. And actually, Darren Amogoslu has some very strict or very firm views on that. So on this question, will AI one day be cited as a co-author of scientific papers? And how do we approach this hype versus revolution? And what's your view on that?
At the moment, I think I will, thanks to my colleague who gave me this autocomplete images, the next word, because to me, every time it will remind me this is an autocomplete next token model. There is no intelligence in it. So at the moment, yes, it can write an excellent text of a scientific paper, much better than I or many other paper, because it has learned from a trillion really of text. And this is very useful actually for us to write better, to be able to say, oh, this is a good summary. It did think well how to put those together, so we can learn from this. But at the end of the day, it's an autocomplete to complete text. To me, no, an AI cannot be a co-author of a paper. Would you say thank you for ChatGPT or thank you to Claude or things like that?
So 45 seconds for you, from your perspective, Aude, hype or revolution?
I think I was supposed to answer the question in the panel.
Okay,
Later.
So we'll take it later. It's a little bit of a teaser for you to stay along. Aude, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, so we're now going to deep dive into a use of AI from a research perspective. And we're delighted to welcome on stage Professor Markus BUEHLER. Markus will dive into a fascinating use of AI in his work, especially towards creating new materials, testing those materials as well. The implication for industries like the construction industry could be very significant, so that's why we're very excited to have Markus with us. Markus is the McAfee Professor of Engineering at MIT. He's a member of the Center for Material Science and Engineering and the Center for Computational Science and Engineering at the Schwarzman College of Computing as well. He holds academic appointments both in two departments, the Mechanical Engineering Department and the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. Markus, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here in the introduction, and great talk by Aude this morning. So yeah, I'll dive into, get a deep dive into how we use AI for especially material science applications in physics. So we're going to really constrain ourselves to thinking how we build machines that can have awareness about physics. And the kind of space that we're working in is material science. And so we're looking at, and most of you are familiar with this, materials have a really complex structure, right? So you look at something like the Eiffel Tower, which is right outside actually here. And it's made from building blocks, beams, steel pieces, ultimately grains in steel. You have maybe, molecules, if it's a polymer, all the way down to the individual atoms. And so the question really is really big, and I've worked in this for a couple of decades now in trying to model systems like these, try to understand how things behave, materials behave, and how they fail in particular. And especially how we design better materials, obviously. This is really the holy grail, if you wish, of this challenge. And it's big, okay, because the structural complexity is enormous. I showed you in the previous slide kind of a schematic overview, but this is an actual material, a protein material like spider silk. At the micro scale, if you look at a spider web, maybe a cobweb, with a microscope, it looks like this, sort of a millimeter scale. If you take an electron microscope and you look inside the molecular structure, you can see the things on the right. These are the polymer chains, the water molecules. So you can just see the enormous complexity. So the question becomes, can we build machines that can actually design things like this, understand them, and make predictions? So I would say, and I'll try to take a perspective here of, going back 70 years and then talking about what we've done in the last couple of years and what the future might hold. For 70 years, since we had big computers, 1950s essentially, we've been solving these problems, or trying to solve them by what we call multi-scale modeling, right? So we basically build models of these molecules and we scale them up by coarse graining multiple molecules into a chain, maybe into particles, into finite elements, into representative volumes and things like that. So those of you who work in engineering are very familiar with this. And then ultimately we built what we call a continuum model, which is sort of the largest scale of representation, mostly used in engineering today. That is not feasible, not tractable really to be used to solve, especially inverse problems, okay? Because the computational complexity is really big. And actually one day we'll look back and actually think this was really a dead end. This was not a very smart way of doing things, because I'm simulating, let's say, all these atoms, all these particles, but actually it's not necessary to really understand the motion of every single atom. It's just some atoms, some molecules, some features are important. So we need to figure out how do we model this much more elegantly. So this is how we got into Gen AI actually. And as we try to really challenge this paradigm of modeling things in this way, which doesn't work very well, to really think about, can we build models that can actually begin to understand physics, chemistry, along with other dimensions of how we build models, like symbolism, equations, math, and things like that. And that's what the talk really will be about, and I'll try to answer the question hyper-evolution, and I would say, there's certainly fundamental challenges with today's machine learning models, or AI models, in quotation marks, like Aude said as well. Conventional models, when you're talking about today, they take data, they fit models against data, very complex functions, very complex models, but at the end of the day, they really can't understand how to go outside the training data, right? And that's what you heard in the previous talk, very nicely explained. Is if I want to go where the X is, where I don't have data, a good model would actually allow me to go there, right? I want to go to spaces where I don't know anything about. And so future models, and this is the kind of things we're trying to work on in my lab, are trying to solve this issue, that we don't actually, just go where we are already. We actually want models that can go to the white spaces in between. We want to actually have theories, models, concepts that can go beyond existing knowledge, and that's really the promise of what we ultimately we're trying to do here. So I think if we can figure this out, right, then we're going to have more of a revolution, except for hype, of course, and that's what we're trying to do. So how do we get to this? Well, and I'll kind of make this sort of an educational journey and discuss how we think about the problem and trying to be a little provocative and kind of put things out there for us to think about later in the discussion. But so the key really is to us that we want to think about how do we actually understand things in the world, especially, I'm a material scientist, so I come from materials, but I think it applies to many other areas in science as well. So if you think about a spider web, right, it has all these different structures. The way we actually understand it is if I were to give a talk for an hour about a spider web, right, or maybe, cement, concrete, I wouldn't start by showing you the positions of every atom in the material. It would be pretty boring, right? So what I would do probably, I will talk about functions, I will talk about molecules, sequences, mechanisms, I will talk about relationships. I might tell you, if I have a certain amino acid sequence in this protein, a certain pattern or a certain relationship between the pattern and the function, I can design a better material by tweaking the sequence or maybe getting a different condition, getting a different solvent. And so really it's about relationships. And this is how we got into this. So more than 20 years ago, actually when I joined MIT, about sometime as you, 20 years ago, we started working on graph theory, especially a field of mathematics called category theory. And this really is about representing information, knowledge, relationships through graphs. And it's sort of shown on the top here. So this is how we think about modeling stuff. And this is something we've developed this framework, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and couldn't really automate this because it required humans to create these graphs. In the last few years, the big breakthrough has been we can actually automate this process and have artificial intelligence machines, machine learning techniques to create these graphs for us. And so now we can scale this problem actually to much larger dimensions. So this is what you'll hear me mention a few times in the presentation today. And sort of what it means really, the takeaway from this is instead of looking at it like this, I look at it, this behavior of the system. Again, it could be a spider web, could be concrete, could be whatever you're thinking about as graph representations, okay? And so if we can teach machines to organize information into graphs, we have a much more structured way of them to actually solve problems. So the way this works usually is we begin by information. So information could be a measurement, it could be a variable in an equation, it could be an image, a video, whatever. And we digitize this using a process called tokenization. So we have to find a way of basically giving it to a computer as a set of numbers. And this is what all machine learning really begins to do. But then we ask this model to understand how these concepts, these bits of information are connected, right? And so this is where the graph comes in. And so this is what we usually think about more like knowledge, right? So we want to understand how information A and information B is related and how it relates to information C, and maybe context dependent on the question I'm asking. Okay, so this is sort of how we think about it. And then we want to ultimately build the model to make predictions, right? So what you see in Innovitis or design prediction, or what is the next experiment I want to do, things like that. Okay, and so ultimately what we do in my lab, a lot of times we work on sustainability applications. So we think about building new molecules with new properties, new materials, create clean water, filtration, food. We've worked on cement a little bit. We work on structural materials and things like this. And infrastructure, I took this from your website. So this, of course, I think you're very interested in building better resilient materials, make them cheaper, make them environmentally friendly. And a lot of this journey usually begins, at the molecular scale. So brief recap before we go on to some of the more substance is this. So this is how we've done things for 70 years. We begin by building a representation of the material behavior, usually from quantum mechanics, right? We have maybe interaction between atoms. It's a graph as well, yes, but the graph is in Euclidean space local. Okay, so you, in order for you to solve this boundary value problem, you have to integrate this equation of motion, whatever you look at, many times for a long time. And this is what makes this so complicated. So this is a beautiful prediction of a movie of dislocation mechanics, but it took a big supercomputer to predict this from the motion of every atom. So what we're saying is, well, we can we find different ways of modeling this behavior, not by using only this information, but actually building a graph representation of this description. And if we can do this, there's a couple of things that really happen that are very exciting. First, I can build graph representations of many different kinds of building blocks, elementary information, okay? So it could be numbers, yes, obviously, but it can also be variables in an equation. So if you think about algebra, and this is what category theory originally actually came from, is describing sort of fundamentally how algebra works in mathematics, you can describe these as building block interaction to describe what we call algebra, or how we do math, essentially. And we can also integrate this, of course, with more numerical techniques. And so all of these become part of the same framework. And that's actually quite exciting, because it's the first time in our history that we have this integrated framework. We can put all these different things together. And we think, that this can ultimately help us solve these very complex problems, like the inverse problems. So Aude said, we have huge infinite design spaces, and it literally is infinite, because it's larger than the universe, actually. So if you take a chain of 100 amino acids in a protein, and you want to design that, you have more possibilities than we have atoms in the universe, okay? And that's pretty daunting. So it means literally is infinite, because we don't really know too much about the universe, I guess. And so this is a problem that is big. And so we need to figure out ways of predicting candidates, perhaps, for a new cement or new steel or new polymer that are not infinite, but actually maybe 1,000 candidates or 10 candidates or something like this. And so this is what my lab really tries to do. The problem is big even for forward problems. Let's say you're interested in disease modeling, right? So brittle bone disease is a disease that's pretty widespread. This disease actually is caused by mutation one amino acid, so one DNA letter wrong out of thousands. But not every mutation makes a difference, only certain mutations out of those possibilities, right? So this is a daunting problem again. Rapid aging disease is another disease like this. Small mutation, big difference, but it matters what it is. You have fracture. This is a problem I think most of you are familiar with, where a few atoms near the crack tip actually determine whether a structure will fail, or an iceberg will fail, or how a glacier will melt. So these are all problems that are multi-scale, they're daunting, and very small details matter, and we need to figure out what these small details are. And again, so we believe graph-based reasoning is really a powerful method to do this. So what makes it possible today? So why am I here today? Why are we all today? I mean, one is compute, and we just have more compute, more cheaply available, almost free, and that means we can build larger models. For me in physics, I can build bigger models that understand better physics, probably, and in the neural network domain as well, we can build larger models. Once we have a structure on how to build these representations, I can scale them up, and I can make better predictions. Hyperreal, I mean, this is an indication. So Microsoft announced a few days ago that they're going to purchase or have an agreement with an old nuclear reactor in the United States that actually had an accident, but it's still there, and they're going to basically boot it up again to build a data center to power AI. Google has announced this recently as well. Of course, Elon Musk built the world's largest supercomputer a few days ago, within 20 days or so. So there are enormous investments being made by industry, of course, in AI. And so the scale is important, having this available. But what can we do with it? So, one of the things I talked about earlier is we can ingest lots of different information. In fact, we can ingest molecules. We can ingest information about papers, books, legal documents, and everything. And the idea is that you can bring them into this AI model, and let the AI model try to understand the data and to make predictions. And this is what I showed earlier, right? So we have this kind of digitization, tokenization, we build representations, we build relationships, and we hopefully can use the model. What we're trying to do there actually is build an operator. So I've done this for many years. We've built new finite element models, we've built new potentials. These are operators, or new equation, new PDE. Now we're building operators that are a little more ambitious, that go towards the point of modeling the thinking process or reasoning, at least scientific reasoning. I think that's an area we can reach probably first in this case. So how does this work? And so this is now really, is an important part of why we think this is, really a game changer. Conventional models, whether it be a data-driven model or a PDE, actually, one of the key weaknesses is it has no situational awareness or awareness of its own predictions. Right? So if you think about it, of course, Ort showed the max token prediction. Right? These models are, they don't really understand what they're predicting. Right? They predict it and then that's it. If I solve a PDE, it's the same thing, by the way, right? So I use a PDE and make a prediction. The PDE knows nothing about whether the prediction is accurate or not. We look at the results, we test it, we understand the context. So we have a process of evaluating these predictions, and we don't really just rely on the models. So what we're trying to build, though, are models that can do some of that reflection about their own predictions. And this is really where AI is moving into, I think. And then, of course, we have a much more powerful model, right? So we don't just predict. The model has a way of understanding its own predictions to some extent, and of course, as we go on in time, it'll be better. And then we can hopefully, design complex materials. So how do we build this? We build this actually so we build a lot of biologically inspired materials. That's where my lab came from. But we also have learned that building, models using bio-inspired principles or AI models actually is also very useful. Okay, and so what happens in biology to build something like a beautiful flower is the flower isn't made out of a single thing. It's actually made from building blocks, right? And these building blocks are the same building blocks, actually, no matter what shape the flower has or what type of flower you have, right? It's the same stuff chemically, but it's arranged differently. We call it UDPs. We've worked on this for quite a while, developed sort of theories around that. And so the question is, can we use this actually in building AI models as well? And the answer is yes. And so the way we're approaching this is to think, okay, so if we want to build a machine that can solve more complex problems, we do want to start by building, machines that can do, or models that can sort of solve complex but smaller problems, like some of the things we've done. And without any more details, happy to talk about it, of course, in the questions, but we can build AI models that can predict properties of very complex molecules, like this collagen molecule that causes brittle bone disease. And so this model is not smart. I mean, all it does, it takes the sequence and it makes a prediction on whether this protein is stable, what properties it has, or we can invert the problem as well, like take a sequence and predict the structure of a protein and so on. But the model doesn't really have an awareness of what it does. It just makes very good predictions, though, right? So this is very useful in science, of course. Many applications. We can design molecules. There's some work actually funded by the IBM lab that OLIVIER leads, where we can design new protein molecules. This is a problem that I did not think I'll ever live long enough to actually be able to do. Now I can do it on my laptop, right? So I can design, proteins that nature has never invented, but I can make them with these models. And these, proteins have certain properties, structures, functions. You can do the same for concrete. You can do the same for polymers. I've done this recently even for very complex dynamical processes where we have, so proteins in biology, they don't just sit there, they actually move. And the way our cells work is that they will interact with proteins, they will pull on the protein, they will try to stretch it. There's like springs, they respond with very complex signatures and relationships. So this is something that's been known actually, you can see this here, so for about 25 years, people have been able to study this experimentally. Forward problem, like take a protein, study its mechanical signature. What we can now do, thanks to AI, is to invert this problem. Not only can I predict how this protein will behave when it's being pulled or when it's being stretched, how it moves, but I can actually also design proteins that do that have this particular behavior in the inverse direction. So if you tell me I want this particular signature of behavior, I can design the protein for you. So this is sort of similar technology as you've seen before in the fusion model. And we use this for designing proteins for food, fibers, plastic replacements, right? So there's a big space there. Architecting materials, right? So you can come up with, new microstructures, again, to meet certain mechanical responses. So all of these are really cool applications, but the models are very good, but they don't have any awareness, right? So they just make a prediction and it's up to us to maybe test the prediction, right? So now let's get to the next level of what AI can do, or what we're working on, is to think about, well, not only make the prediction, but actually can the model sort of think about its own prediction, and can we, really, begin to have an iterative, recursive discussion of the model, or maybe multiple models with itself. And in fact, this is how we approach this. Again, we're using biology as an inspiration for everything, because we think that's a good way to start. Biology has created some really amazing systems. And, material function emerges by interaction of building blocks. intelligence to some extent, and especially we like to look at things like ants or swarms of animals, right? So they actually are little agents that interact and they solve problems. Like these ants are building an ant bridge, right? And each ant individually can't do it, but if you put a bunch of them together, they can actually solve this problem, which is much bigger than themselves. Literally, it's bigger. The gap is bigger than the ant itself. So we can do this using AI as well. So there's sort of 3 different instantiations that I'd like to talk about that we've done in the last couple of years. So one obvious one is to say, okay, I have these amazing AI models, like one for protein folding, one for designing new cements, one for designing a process. I can just put them together as experts, right? So I can build an AI model that has these different experts. And I can have another model that would predict which expert should I use, right? That's good, but it's not really smart. It doesn't have an understanding of what it does. So what we do to do this is we actually teach the model something a little different than we have taught models before. And so the way we're approaching this is the following way. So we basically teach individual models to do things really well, like designing molecules, understanding chemistry, building predictions of math. And then we teach the model in a second step in training, not just to solve these specific problems, but actually to try to figure out how to solve the problems without actually changing the model itself, right? So it's a different problem. So it's like if all of you are being taught something today, everyone gets a skill, you spend an hour in a room and you learn it, and then I say, okay, now you can no longer update your understanding of this particular skill you've learned, but now I want you to learn how to work together to solve something, right? So this is exactly what we're doing in this way. So the second training step, actually, we freeze the models, but we teach the models how to work together to solve the problem better, okay? And so this is sort of a different step. And when we use the model, we do the same thing. We basically actually ask the model to, before they make a prediction, so before they make a next token prediction, before they predict the next image, they actually have to reflect on that. So they think about the prediction. They think, how do I organize my team of experts in this case before I actually make a prediction? And so this is very powerful, very flexible as well. And so this is how it looks like. So if you make a prediction with a model like this, and this is actually as the model produces a solution to a problem, like produces an image, produces a design, or makes a prediction about a property of a molecule, it will continuously reconfigure itself. So this is sort of schematic. Well, it's actually the real data, but sort of schematically you can see this. It organizes its capabilities differently in ways that the model has never seen before. So the generative aspect of AI is applied to the AI itself here, right? So not only do we generate new distributions of solutions, but the AI also generates new distribution of how itself is organized. So you can see the kind of the next step in the process, how we're modeling this. What can it do? Well, these models, they can be used to do many different things now. So in one single model, I can solve regression problems, like what properties does a molecule have. I can also use this model to ask questions. Which one's the strongest sequence? Why is the sequence the strongest? And the model is beginning to connect the dots because, remember, we have this big graph and all the information is in the model, so it can actually make associations. And so this, I think, is where we want to go in the future because we want models, as Aude said very nicely, that can explain themselves. They're not just the black box of predictions. We want to be able to have the model being understand itself. So we can actually bake this even further. And instead of having the model think for one step, we can have the model think for many, many more steps, actually. And so this is some very recent work we've done where we don't just have the model think one step and organize itself. We can actually have very long periods of organizational sort of questions. And in this case, we use techniques, it's called reinforcement learning as a framework, where we don't teach the model directly how to answer, basically by fitting distributions. We actually teach the model particularly how to get better outcomes, rewarding the model if it thinks well, if it organizes itself well, and we basically penalize the model if it does a bad job. And in this process, we have sort of multiple agents within the model that do this job. And so in this flowchart, a little complicated, but you can see in this particular version, we have 2 agents, 2 ants basically, right? And so one agent will produce the draft solution. So produces a process, a step-by-step sort of breakdown of the problem, and we can teach the model, beginning to teach the model how we would do it, right? If I solve a materials design problem, I might say, what material am I talking about? What are the design principles? What are the processes? And the model will kind of break it down like this. And then the model will critique itself. So we'll actually provide a critique of itself, its thinking process. The other agents then will get to work and try to improve the thinking process. And actually, I can repeat this many, many times. And these relationships between these agents are adversarial. So they have different interests, right? So the agents, kind of compete, and thereby the solution will be improved recursively until I make a final prediction. And so this sort of the way, if you do this in natural language, this is how it would look like, right? So the thinking process will go through, kind of steps of breaking down the problem. There's a reflection or a critique process where the actual thinking is sort of critiqued, okay? And then it's improved if you do recursive iterations. And in the final answer, and this is just sort of conceptually shown here, will be the answer, right? And so if you do this, you can see if you repeat this process of correction, the answer will get better and better, right? So you're no longer sort of just making a prediction and have no awareness, but the model will actually begin to develop an ability to sort of understand how to put things together, how to improve things. And I won't really have time to really talk about the details here, except that this builds on existing models. So this particular technology is made in a way that is very easy to apply to existing foundation models, right? So you have foundation model developed by Llama or maybe OpenAI. You can further train them to build the structured thinking process. And this first phase is really where we teach the model how we would think. So I'm giving an example of how I would like to break down the problem. In the second phase, I'm actually no longer prescribing this. And so the second phase, which is really heavily inspired by, again, reinforcement learning, we don't tell the model how to think. In fact, we're masking it out. We just say, I want you to think here, or reflect, or organize your thoughts, but I'm not telling you how to do it, but I want you to make a perfect answer. And in fact, this model has sort of a couple of twists. It actually gets more difficult problems as it's being trained. And so the model has a more and more difficult time to give better answers, because the answers we're comparing against, is the answer from the trained model, right? And so the model sort of has to successively solve more complex problems. And I think this, I want to highlight here, this technique, and I don't know, I thought I put it on there, but it doesn't have a data set in the conventional sense. So usually when you train a model, you have data sets, and you train the model, and then you get an answer. This actually is designed so that you do not have a data set in a conventional sense. In fact, the model is is repeatedly producing its own data set at every iteration and then training itself. So it really is sort of a model that can train itself in giving better answers. Now, that's actually not the final answer, I think. So what we're really doing very heavily is then to use these models that are pretty good by themselves and actually put them also in a set of multiple agents, agent 1, agent 2, agent 3. That's something where we can really kind of think about solving really complex problems. So like, for example, I can give a problem like this on the left. So I'm basically telling the model, I want you to get a potential, and I want you to output the potential in a beautiful table that I can put in my simulation code or something like this. And this set of agents will actually solve the entire problem. It will figure out how to do this, and it will produce a solution. So what you see on the bottom here. So the way this works is that multiple agents are put together with different capabilities. So some agents are going to be very good in solving physics problems. Some agents are going to be very good in searching literature. Some have access to the internet, so they can actually search in real time for all the scientific abstracts or papers. And so these set of systems are having, literally, and no pun intended, agency. So they're agents, but they actually have agency in interacting with the world. And that collection of real-time data is really critical. The other thing that they can do, they can actually run physics. So I said to you in the beginning that we're interested in building models that can draw upon what we've done for literally 1,000 years, running physics simulations and writing down PDEs. Why do we want to throw this away? Here, I can actually create agents that can simulate physics. And the models can either write their own code and execute it, or I can give these models some hints or solution suggestions. I can say, I have a particular set of simulators that I'm using, you've been using in your company for decades. Those become agents. And they can be used to create data on the fly. So this really, now you can see things are coming together, because this can actually assess the prediction and not only make a next token prediction, have some awareness, self-correct, but it can also test it against physics. It can test it against literature. It might ask you to do an experiment, because these models might not be able to do experiments themselves. Of course, if you connect into autonomous labs, they might be able to ultimately. We're mainly theory, so we don't have autonomous labs quite yet, but others are working on this. And so you can solve problems like in protein design. So this is just one example where you can actually design new proteins. Like before in the example, the model actually we developed before was one of those particular models that design new proteins I showed you. This becomes one of the many agents that I have now in the system. And so the previous work, again, building block, nature inspired, I'm creating a lot of small models. Now I make them part of a larger system, larger ecosystem of agents They interact, and they can solve pretty complex problems. What's interesting here, when we did the original protein design work, we checked the predictions by essentially doing MD molecular simulations and using, for example, tools like AlphaFold. Here, I can simply make AlphaFold, and in this case, we used OmegaFold, which is a similar technique, and make it part of the agent. So the model, even though my earlier model could not fold the protein, I used another lab's code for this. Now this system is integrative. I can simply make another AI model, OmegaFold or AlphaFold, part of this ecosystem, and the model can actually, design the sequences, design the proteins, run an MD simulation potentially, make a picture, analyze the picture, and reason over the results. Okay, and so this is something that Aude also brought up, multimodality. So what's really essential here in science in particular are multimodal, machines that can look at different inputs. For example, we've got models that can look at images, scientific images, like a pollen particle. And if I have a model like this, I can say, okay, I have an existing design maybe, so if I'm doing bounds by design, and I want to take this image, and I want to create something like a tough material or a structure, a microstructure for a material. These are the kinds of things that only humans could do until a few years ago, because I had to look at the image and I could make a picture like this probably. Now the machine can do this for me. It can make architectural design suggestions. So this is part of a larger framework where we basically go through a step-by-step process to extract design concepts to meet a certain design demand. Then ultimately we're producing images, representations, which look like that. And so this is an architectural example where we're trying to combine design ideas from different fields. And then we have, we can do this for microstructures and create kind of interesting, weird new materials that combine, spider webs with leaf microstructures. And we can make 3D models as well. So just to show you, the output modalities also can be pretty flexible. So we can make 3D representations output. We can 3D print it, right? So this is why we're doing this, or put in a CAD model and things like that. So that's sort of just to show you, there's a lot of flexibility in how you ultimately produce data, right? So it doesn't have to just be an image. It can be 3D model, and I can actually print it and have it in my hand. I didn't bring it here, but you can actually see it in your hand. These models can really begin to reason over, I want to say reason, I mean really in the sort of sense of physics, about complex situations. So for example, I can give this model, these scenarios A and B, a fracture, and you can kind of see what I'm doing here. I'm asking the model, what do you see? Toughness, which one's tougher, which one's less tough. That's really amazing because I can use this in automation. So if I have a machine in manufacturing, or if I have something that in experimentation, I can give a picture of what's currently being made, and the model can actually assess the quality of this. It has a really good understanding actually of what is going on physically. So this model is of course trained on thousands of scientific papers, hundreds of thousands of images in the science areas. This is what we do, right? So we create models that have these capabilities. They also have sort of situational awareness of what will come next. For example, I can show the model a picture of a crack, a loading condition, and I can ask this model what's going to happen next. Or I can ask the model, what kind of stress distribution do you expect? And so on the left are the correlations of stress distribution. So this is a pretty complex problem, as you know. So the only way to solve this is by having really good understanding of physics and running maybe a finite element or molecular dynamics simulation. The model actually can make these predictions very easily. So it understands very well what the stress distributions are. It can even tell us what's going to happen next. So this, the model can say, okay, I'm going to have damage, or I have no crack propagation. How much damage am I going to have? I can even predict with these models the actual evolution of, for example, things like fracture. And so here we're basically producing a movie, okay? But it's not a movie in a sense, a Hollywood movie, but it's a movie. It's a simulation of how cracks will propagate or not, right? So we can predict these kind of dynamical processes. The last example, I'm out of time, but I would take 2 more minutes for this, is, how do we take this kind of graph idea and maybe think about how we model innovation? And for this, we didn't just rely on the internal representation of what's in the model to understand graphs, relationships. We actually trained this model to build graph representations in natural language. And so this really comes back to the category theory work we did 20 years ago. And at that time, we could build tiny graphs. We had to make them. Now, these AI models can make these graphs on their own. And in fact, I can give them thousands of papers, thousands of patents, even more if I have more compute. And the models will organize this information into, what we call knowledge, and it creates gigantic graph representations of this. And what's really interesting now, And as details, of course, I won't be able to talk about or not time to talk about, but this graph is a connected graph. So if you click on a node, I think I showed it, well, I have it actually here, you can see how this node concepts relate to all the other concepts in this. So you can click a node on maybe mycelium or sustainability, and you can find relationships, you can find paths. So if you're an innovator and you want to know maybe concrete sustainability, maybe you have a third node as well that says something about water, this graph will tell you, how these things are related and what the different paths are. And so what we do is we use this kind of structural representation that the model has created now to solve problems. And one of the things we can do what we call graph reasoning. So of course, a graph, I'm out of time, so I can't really spend more time on graph theory, but in graphs, it have a lot of rich information. If I look at a node, I can understand how important the node is, how many connections it has, how critical is a node on the path between different other nodes. So there's a lot in there that I can actually use for the AI model to think about. And that's what we call graph reasoning. So we can use these relationships and do this. Now, in an experiment we published recently, we took this graph, and we didn't just answer questions, which of course it can do really well. We actually let the model explore discovery. And so what we did is we basically built a multi-agent system, again, like before, multiple AI systems that work together. And we let them sort of go wild on this graph, right? So and we basically give a task, let's say, yeah, I'm interested in relationships and innovation between two different concepts. That's what we did in the paper, but you can do more than that, of course. The model then will sample all the different paths between these relationships. And the agents have different jobs to do, right? So some agents are just tasked in creating crazy wild ideas, while other agents are supposed to address feasibility. Other agents are supposed to search the internet about whether or not this has been done, maybe search patent databases or search internet papers. And ultimately, the outcome, of course, is not only a crazy idea, but a crazy feasible idea that can be made and that nobody else has actually attempted, right? So this is sort of what the model ultimately will produce. It produces, in this case, if we're creating scientific hypotheses and research ideas, very long documents. So the agents ultimately come up with something like, I think, 10,000 word documents. It's very detailed. And they actually go through different stages. So this is sort of what the model ultimately does, fully autonomously. So we're not telling the model to do this. The model organized themselves to do this. And of course, then we could put it in one of the other agents we have to come up with a manufacturing process. So this is not part of the original paper, but this is in other work. And obviously, you can imagine we're doing this right now. So we can take these predictions and now actually create an actual process, how to make this material. And this is scalable. And so what's really interesting about this is that, we're no longer just predicting a next token, right? We're actually assessing, evaluating, reflecting on all these things we've talked about. But it's scalable still because with more compute, I can, you can run this, in a big supercomputer and you can create 10,000, 100,000 research ideas. All of them are ranked and scaled. I looked at examples, and so this is something that you, as a human, there's no way I can read 100,000 ideas, obviously. In fact, you feel very little next to this. Even if you read a 10,000 word document, it will take me and my students weeks to assess this, whereas the model has produced, 10,000 of them. So it really, kind of is a point where we see the limitations of human intelligence, right? As understanding these things. But yeah, you can assess them manually, and we go through this in the paper to talk about what the model has actually identified, and the relationships are kind of mind-blowing in how they come up with new connections. Just like a good innovator or crazy scientist, right, will come up with new ways of connecting ideas. So with that, I'm gonna, thank you for the attention. Obviously, the field is very big, and so here's the end. Thank you for your interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Markus. And I'm sure you can feel all the passion that Markus has, and it's actually amazing to see the impact that AI has on your research, how you're approaching your research, and all the wonderful work that you do. So we'll take a few questions. The first one, do you have any concrete examples of novel materials being developed through this new approach? Which sectors will most benefit from these kinds of approaches?
Yeah. So most of the examples that we have worked on is in the biological field. We've developed new proteins. We've designed new growth factors for making artificial meat. I don't know if you guys are working on that, but that's something that depends on the sponsor, obviously, who's funding this. So this is work funded by the US Department of Agriculture. So we've developed proteins for meat production. We've made proteins for food coatings. Actually, this is some of the work I mentioned earlier with IBM to increase the shelf life of food. We have made composites. We've made materials that have higher toughness out of weak ingredients. And once you go down to the specific application, I mean, you can see this has applications for many different industries, many different fields. When we work with partners in industry, usually it's a very specific problem. Like some industry folks might want us to find a replacement material for something they no longer want to use, or they wanted to find sometimes, we worked with BASF, for example, on some of the composite work to create very strong and tough composites that have patterns that humans just haven't quite imagined yet, right? So using some of the bio-inspiration. So those are some of the things. But it depends on the industry, but we've done usually in the structural space and protein space and polymer space. I have worked on concrete many years ago, not with AI, but that is definitely something I think is sort of ready for really some big impacts there as well.
Great. We'll take the next one. I really like the question, and I'll add something to it. So how can company engineers and their R&D labs manipulate such complex models to apply them to their own specific challenges? And should they develop their own models themselves, or should they partner with someone else to reach the same objective? Yeah,
it's a good question. So I didn't actually really talk about this. This is a good opportunity. So we do obviously everything open source. I mean, we do use some frontier models that, especially for the multi-agent representations where we just don't have open source models that are good enough yet. So we use OpenAI models for that. But all this stuff that I talked about, building our own models and so on, and the reflection model, preflexor, all of this is done open source, first of all. I mean, we're developing them based on open source models. We release all the codes open source, the algorithms. But also, we have a very strong interest in creating small models. And I think I also showed this in some of the faculty. So for example, the examples actually with the preflexo algorithm was actually implemented in a literally a baby model. It's a 3 billion parameter model that I was very surprised that it can actually learn these sort of steps in thinking and reflection and self-correction. And why we're doing this? Well, we're doing this because, first of all, we're at a university, right? We're not Elon Musk or Microsoft that can build their own nuclear power plants and data centers. But we actually think also that in industry, so I answered your question, it's really critical because we want to be able to build models that you can run without the need of external collaborators, potentially, right? So if you rely on a company for everything you do and they don't tell you exactly how they do their business, right, it could be a threat. And so one of the things we're trying to do, really build things that we can do in academic settings, but also you can do in a commercial setting that you can own. You can own the models, you can run them locally, and they're economical, right? So they're not always a trillion parameter model. Actually, there might be very small models that can do really, really good things. So and if you do this, of course, you have the ecosystem locally. Now, partnering, I think, there's a lot of IP or intellectual property or technological know-how in the various processes, in training the models, in setting up the algorithm, in using them, understanding how they're correctly used. A lot of abuse, misuse, if you don't understand. But that's true for any model, right? So if you were to take a finite element code and you were to take that finite element code without being an expert and you were to try to design, I don't know, something totally weird the model has not been developed for, wouldn't work. It's the same for AI models, but it's a little bit more misleading because the models kind of look like they're talking like us, and yeah, they must know what they're doing. No, they don't, right? So you have to have some understanding of the limitations. And so I think what I recommend is to have you got to create your own staff probably that has understanding in physics, very important. We're talking a lot about this. I mean, who does this kind of work? Well, you need folks, staff that aren't computer scientists only. They also have to have an understanding of material science and mechanics, mechanical engineering, civil engineering. You need computer scientists, of course, as well. But you need to have a team that understands sort of both sides of the coin. And that's how I also structure my lab. And I think if you lead a team like this, and for me, leading my research lab, you have to really get your hands dirty. I do a lot of work myself because of that. I came from doing models, physics models, and I really needed, for me to be able to be an effective mentor to my students, a team leader, I needed to understand these things at a very deep level. So you're going to have people in leadership as well that are going to get into the weeds, essentially, yeah.
Great. We'll stay in that space of knowledge management, because I think your last example really resonated with, or resonates with that question. How can AI be leveraged to model and transfer knowledge from retiring experts?
Yeah, exactly. So this is part of the motivation for, the graph reasoning stuff at the end. First of all, we're interested in modeling discovery, of course, but also a lot of times when I work with industry, they have these, experts that have worked in the company for maybe 30 years, and they have a wealth of information, and how do you pass this on? Or you have different teams that have never talked to each other. Naturally, knowledge graph construction using AI is actually a quite straightforward thing to do, but one that is extremely powerful. It's expensive because you need to do lots of inference, lots of organization of the information into these graphs, but I think it's a very effective way of doing precisely that. So, and not only for retiring folks, but also for teams. I mean, I know you have lots of different companies. So the idea is that, maybe many of your divisions have worked on similar problems, but not connected the dots. I will make one plug here for a little more technical part behind this. So you might ask, how do we actually mine these graphs? And I showed the connections, but there's another way how we're mining the graphs, and it's in the first paper, is using isomorphic mapping. So actually, and this comes from the original work we've done on graphs 20 years ago. When you think about how concepts are organized in your organizations, it's a lot of times they're similar structures, right? So like how you do business, how you work with customers, even though the customers are different, the actual material is different, but the way you interact, the patterns you use to create a certain outcome are very similar. So isomorphic searches in graphs allow us to do this between different graphs. And so one of the things, again, I didn't talk about is you might have a graph about materials, you might have another graph about customer relationships. They don't really overlap. So if I wanted to make a connection, they might not connect at all. Isomorphic mining of the graphs, isomorphic mapping actually allows us to do this. And so we have done this in academic settings to connect things like structures in music with structures in materials, actually rigorously mathematically, not just talking about how it might look like, but actually letting an algorithm find relationships in a graph. And isomorphic mapping basically means, so just so you're not familiar with this, you have a graph, and you have another graph, or a subgraph of a larger graph, and the graphs look exactly the same topologically, but what's in the nodes, in the edges, is different. That's isomorphic mapping. And you can relax this to make it almost similar or identical fully, or to what degree, but that's precisely what you can do. So you can not only you kind of capture the knowledge from retiring people, but you can actually maybe learn across different divisions. So that's an area that, you can do that actually quite easily already. I mean, it takes work, but this is already possible with existing AI techniques that we've developed. Yeah.
All right, we have less than 2 minutes. We'll take one more question, and then we'll go for a break. So you'll have a chance to interact directly with Markus at the break. Do you believe generative design of materials will help improve the performance cost ratio of existing materials, or be a total game changer?
Yes, of course. I always use. So I use the example, we can all, now everyone's familiar with protein folding, and then Nobels was given for this. And, when this happened, it's basically a problem that we couldn't solve for 50 years. That time was 50 years or so. Since we knew there are proteins, we didn't know how to predict the structure of proteins. The only way was to experiment. And people have worked on it for a long time. In fact, one of the Nobel laureates, David Baker, actually was working on this. He couldn't figure it out. It was the computer scientist ultimately, Demis Hassab was actually in his team figured it out. He won half the prize for what's called protein design, but this was a moment where you can see AI has, allowed us to solve a problem that we just couldn't figure out. We couldn't do it, even though there were hundreds, thousands of people working on it. It was a very serious problem for disease and so on. Drug design, yeah, the answer is clearly yes, because in materials it's not a similar problem. The space is much more diverse. You might be interested in this particular Portland cement composition. Another company might be interested in another type of composition. In protein folding, we put all of the energy onto this one single problem. So yeah, it will take resources and commitment, but absolutely, the problem is very similar. And I've talked about design problems and materials. These are non-tractable problems. There's no way, you don't even have enough atoms in the universe to, even if you experimentally were to do it and you had infinite time, you couldn't do it because there's not enough material in the universe, unless you recycle the universe, but then you have to destroy yourself, I guess. So not possible. And so there are examples, I think if you point just to some popular examples, you can see, and yeah, absolutely. You know, and it's not that you want, I mean, and I hope I make clear, we're going to be a partner in this, of course. You know, I mean, it's not going to be that you know, the model will predict this single molecule, single composition. You might want 10 different candidates, right? But those candidates are going to be out of the top. I mean, those are the ones you go to the lab and actually make it, right? And then you have a way. So that's how we usually work on problems. So yeah, this is absolutely, and especially expanding the horizon of imagination. I mean, if you are working on cement, concrete, so I use this example, I mean, for 30 years, you're going to think this is how it should work, right? Because all the literature, everything points to this. But AI doesn't have the biases of how we think about concrete. I mean, and this is true for proteins. So my proteins, if I look at the proteins my model has designed, it is absolutely mind-boggling because the protein that has come up with might be, maybe let's say you wanted to make a stronger silk protein. It doesn't just use spider silk and insect silks as a basis. Actually, it might use that, but it also is going to put a protein from maybe an ancient insect in there, or maybe you know, skin proteins or something. So it actually combines ideas from fields that are totally unrelated. So if you're a spider silk designer, you live in the world of those sequences. The AI tells us that's not actually the only thing you should do. You should look at maybe even an extinct dinosaur. I mean, I made that up right now, but you know, but they really you know, things that come into play that the model says. So yeah, absolutely, this is what we want to do. We want to kind of have models help us broaden the horizon of how we innovate and create things.
Thank you very much, Markus. Thank you. We are right on time. We're going to take a 25-minute break. Please feel free to engage with the faculty you heard. Engage with the one you will hear of right after the break, and we'll be back here at 11 o'clock. Thank you.